Welcome students, welcome to this presentation on reciprocal demand and offer curves. John Stuart Mill advocated the use of the ideas of the classical economist. However, he went to re-examine the ideas of Smith, Malthus and Ricardo and what is famously known as his restatement of the classical ideas. He wrote his book Principles of Political Economy with some of their applications to social philosophy in 1848. This book also examined the section on international trade. He found that Ricardo had focused on the supply aspect and had neglected the demand side. And so Mill propounded his theory of reciprocal demand or mutual demand to explain the actual determination of equilibrium of terms of trade between nations. In his own words, he said, the reciprocal demand, he explains it this way. The actual ratio at which goods are traded will depend upon the strength and elasticity of each country's demand for the other country's product or upon reciprocal demand. So there is a demand for the other country's product and the demand for this country's product by other countries. The ratio will be stable when the value of each country's export is just enough to pay for its import. So that amount of trade will actually take place when a country can pay for the imports that it makes by giving exports. So this theory actually is like the demand and supply theory in as it works in any other markets. Now, there are two ways of understanding this particular reciprocal demand. One is by using a partial equilibrium analysis, and the other is by using the general equilibrium analysis. In the partial equilibrium analysis, what we do is we take one market at a time, and then we understand how the equilibrium price is determined at a point where the exports of one nation is equal to the imports of the other nation, and vice versa. But when we understand it from a general equilibrium perspective, we can study two markets at the same time. So quantity of exports and imports at each relative prices. So there is a relative price and there is an export and there is an import and there are two countries. All of them can be studied at the same time. And to do this, we use this tool of offer curves. And that is what we shall explain in this particular presentation. What are the assumptions? Since Mill had worked on explaining the Ricardian theory a little more elaborately, therefore the assumptions of Ricardian theory are applicable here, and they have two countries. So here Mill has used Germany and England, and he has used linen and cloth as the two commodities. Otherwise, it is a constant return conditions, full employment, the perfect competition. Then foreign trade is free trade, there is no transport cost. And to understand reciprocal demand, we need to accept the comparative cost theory of Ricardo. So, just a relook at the Ricardian theory this way. Country A can produce 120 units of good X and 100 units of good Y. Then country B can produce 90 units of good X and can produce 80 units of good Y. Now, when these two goods are shown, X and Y, the next question is how much should they actually trade with each other to feel that they have benefited from trade? So, country A can get for every 12 units, it can get only 10 units of Y. And country B, for every 9 units of X, it can get only 8 units of Y. So that is their domestic exchange ratios. Now, coming to the international exchange ratios, what are we finding? Country A will be willing to get into trade if it is willing to, it will get 10 units of Y by exporting anything less than 12 units of X. So if it can get by giving less then that is better for country A. And similarly for country B will be better off if it can get more than 9 units by exporting 8 units of Y. So if it can get more units, then it is better for both the countries. Why? Both the countries want to get more than what is domestically available to them. Now let's look at the idea of general equilibrium using the offer curves approach. Offer curve is a tool, geometric tool developed by Marshall in 1879 to explain the reciprocal demand of mill. And this tool was later refined by Edgeworth and Pareto. This offer curve is a locus of pair of export and import curves quantities that is desired at each possible price ratios. It shows a country's willingness to trade at various possible terms of trade. So the combination of demand for imports and supply of exports. Now this offer curve has got an upward shape for one country, which is shown as OC, where country is selling steel and importing steel and cloth. So OY of steel and OX of cloth is where the two countries have come to some kind of an equilibrium in trade. Now, this offer curve is arrived at by understanding the production possibility curve. For this, let us take the case of autarky. Autarky is a state when a country does not have trade with others, or it is also known as a closed economy. Now, for this, we shall use the production possibility curve or frontier. The production possibility frontier shows the quantities of A and B or X and Y that can be produced by the country with the available limited resources. So T1 is the production possibility curve, and the quantity that it may want to produce is OY of steel and OX of commodity cloth. Now, on this diagram, we shall introduce the community indifference curve. Community indifference curves are like the individual indifference curve, except that we are not talking about individuals' a combination of two goods. We are talking about society's combination of two goods that it will consume. So here, the indifference curve 1, 2, 3, and 4 are shown as the community indifference curve, and of this 4 indifference curve, the second indifference curve IC2 is tangent to the production possibility curve at point S. So at point S, the country decides to produce OY of commodity steel and OX of commodity cloth. Now, we will also introduce the price line or the exchange ratio into the same diagram. This exchange ratio is PP1, and this exchange ratio or price line is tangent to the production possibility curve also at point S. So at point S, the marginal rate of transformation in production is equal to the marginal rate of substitution in consumption. So these terms that I am using here, you would have seen it in the consumer indifference curve, and maybe you would like to watch that video on consumer indifference curve, which I shall give you the link in this description box. So now we have understood the price line here, and we also understood a community indifference curve, and we look at the production possibility curve. This price line or price ratio line is a downward sloping curve, but when we have to use it to explain the offer curve, we shall present it as an upward sloping positive curve than this negative downward sloping curve. So you may wonder why a price ratio line is shown downwards here, a negative slope here, and then later we are using it as a positive slope. So that is how it has been done. Now let us try and understand the offer curves of two countries separately. First, we shall understand the offer curve of country A and apply the same logic to understand the offer curve of country B. Now this offer curve The offer curve can be understood from the point R. So R is the point on price line OP. On the vertical axis, we have A's importable good. What is A's importable good? A is going to import steel, and what is A's exportable good? A is exporting cloth. So vertically, it is importing steel, and it is offering to sell cloth in the international market. Now, this offer of sale and import will take place at different prices. So first let us take the price line OP. At price line OP, the country A is willing to export OQ units of cloth and accept RQ units of steel. Now, let us assume that the price of cloth increases relatively to the price of steel. So, what happens? So, the price line will shift, the price line will rise. So, price line has moved from OP to OP1. When it goes to OP1, then we find that the quantity of cloth and steel will also change. So, the responses of the two countries are going to be different. Country A will have an incentive to sell more or export more because it gets better prices, whereas country B will be looking for reducing its imports, though it needs cloth for its own economy. So, what we can see here is at point R2, the quantity that country A is willing to sell is OQ1, and the quantity of steel that country B will offer is R1Q1. Now, still assume that the price of cloth increases. The price line moves from P1 to P2 and from P2 to P3. So each time the price lines have moved to the left, the points of export and import has also changed. You will find that as the prices have increased, the quantity of offer for purchase will reduce because the country has to pay more for the imports that it is making. And you can see that the export from OQ to OQ1, now it is OQ to OQ2 and OQ2 to OQ3. So the quantity that is offered has increased, but the other country will not be willing to take so much because it has become costly for that country to buy these commodities. So when we join these price line points, that is R, R1, R2 and R3 in a curve form, we get what is called as the offer curve. So we get the offer curve for country A. Now let us look for country B. Now country B's offer curve is a mirror image of country A's offer curve, and the logic is the same except that the items on the vertical axis and the items on the horizontal axis are different. On the vertical axis we now have B's exportable commodity, which is steel, and on the horizontal axis we have B's importable commodity, which is cloth. And the same argument holds good. So the original price line is P dash. At P dash, the country is willing to offer OQ amounts of steel, and country A is willing to give OQS units of cloth. Now, same argument, we can say that the price of the steel has increased. When the price of steel increases, what happens to the quantity of steel that it is willing to offer and the quantity of steel that the other country is willing to buy? So the demand for steel in country A increases, but it will increase at a diminishing rate because it has to pay more for the price rise. So additional quantity of steel offered by country B becomes lesser and lesser because after certain quantity that the country A cannot offer, the quantity of cloth that country A offer cannot be as much as the offer of steel by the country A. Thus, at every rising price, the quantity of steel that it wants to offer can be high, but the quantity of cloth that this country will offer will become lesser and lesser. So these points, if we join, we get S, S1, S2, and S3. These points together indicate to us the offer curve for country B. Now, what we need to do is to come to an equilibrium condition in this international trade for analytical purposes. Now, this offer curve will show a position of equilibrium when the offer curve of A and offer curve of B intersect at a point where what is being offered by country is accepted by the other country and vice versa. So here we say that the free trade equilibrium will happen at point R, where the country is willing to offer Y1 unit of exportable goods, and A is importable, it is accepting, and OX1 is the quantity of exportable and B is importable. So both the countries, whatever they are offering is acceptable to the other country in terms of export and import. So that is a condition of perfect equilibrium. But in real life, we may not find this kind of perfect equilibrium, and there may be a shift of these offer curves to the left or to the right. One of the offer curves may move to the left or to the right, but that indicates that there is a disequilibrium, and this disequilibrium in the international market will correct itself because they were all believers in free market mechanism. So the offer curves will shift to the left or to the right depending upon the two countries' offers, and finally it might reach a position of equilibrium. Let's look at the idea of reciprocal demand with that of elasticity. Now, there are two demand curves and two supply curves. The demand for countries' export and the demand for the country's import. So we are finding two demand curves, and then equally there are two supply curves, countries' supply of export and other countries' supply of import. So we have got two supply curves and two demand curves. Now let us see how this demand curve and supply curves and the respective elasticity will influence the country's trade with the other country. So let's look at the elasticity of demand first. So if the country's export is less elastic, then the country will have a favorable terms of trade. So if a country's export is less elastic, that means then it can the demand for this country's goods are such that the other country cannot do without it. Then even if there is a price rise, that will be favorable to that country. But when the demand for the goods is more elastic, then it will become an unfavorable terms of trade for that particular country. Similarly, when the demand for import is more elastic, terms of trade will be favorable. When the demand for imports is less elastic, terms of trade will be unfavorable. Now look at the elasticity of supply. When the supply of export is less elastic, terms of trade is unfavorable. That means it can't increase the supply or decrease the supply. And if there is an increase or decrease in the demand for that export, this country will not be able to make adjustment, and therefore it is unfavorable. On the other hand, when the supply of export is more elastic, terms of trade will be favorable. And then when you say the supply of import is less elastic, so if the imports that are going to come into the country are less elastic, then the trade will be favorable for that supplying country. And when the supply of import is more elastic, then the trade terms of trade will be unfavorable to the country which is supplying the imports. Now let's look at this idea with a critical view. This critical view is necessary just as we have seen in the earlier diagrams too. So when we critically examine it, what happens is we can find out some gaps, and then these gaps have been worked on by other economists and we get newer theories here. So let us look at the gap here. What is there that is the unrealistic assumptions, but we know that we make these unrealistic assumptions mainly to make the analysis easier. Then the point of where the value of imports and exports are in equilibrium is actually a truism. Whether it can happen in real life or not, it does not throw any light on what determines the terms of trade. It only shows that this equilibrium will be attained in international trade. then the reciprocal demand theory can best apply when both the nations are of equal economic size and strength. Otherwise, if the two countries are of too unequal strength, then the stronger country will definitely have more favorable terms of trade than the country which has got a less favorable terms of trade. So, with this, we have looked into the elementary, basic theories of international trade, and the other theories that are there are extensions of these particular theories. So I hope this lesson has been useful to you, and please subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet subscribed, and do like the channel and or the video, and also post your comments so that I can work on the comments that you send. So thank you very much.